Our next session is, as we've heard, these soil improving cropping systems have obvious benefits and practical and useful, but why are they not being taken up? This is the big question I think that we will be addressing in the next session. So I'd like to welcome Melanie Muro on from Milieu, who's going to talk to us about the barriers to the uptake of 6. Over to you, Mel.
Hello. Well, I was going to say good morning, but it's almost noon. So hello, almost good afternoon. Thank you, Matt. I hope you can see my slide. It seems to be fine. As Matt said, I wanted to present to you today or provide an overview of the barriers facing the wider uptake of 6. This is based on what we learned from stakeholders in the SoilCare study sites, and I need to highlight that I'm broadly referring to barriers. Obviously, some of these factors can be a barrier in one situation. They can also be an enabler in another, but I will just be using the broad term barriers. And as it was already said, why are we talking about barriers? We've seen that the practices that we have tested in SoilCare do have some benefits, even though ideally we would have monitored impacts over a longer period than the 2-3 years that we did. But we can see that there are some positive effects on soil quality and profitability and sustainability in general. But we also see that they're not widely taken up or in some cases even abandoned. So what we did is we explored common barriers to the adoption of soil improving practices as a basis for coming up with recommendations for actions, policy actions that could facilitate a wider uptake of these 6, where they are relevant and where they are suitable, obviously. We focused on different types of barriers, and I will just give you a very quick overview. So we looked at policy and institutional barriers, which include obviously different policy instruments, a mix of voluntary and mandatory, soft versus hard measures. But we also looked at implementation in the sense of monitoring and enforcement, and the implementation at the country level versus EU level. We looked at farmer attitudes and values as part of social cultural factors, accepted behaviors, norms, peer pressures, also trust and social capital, which was already mentioned by Rudy at the beginning. We looked at technical barriers. So what are the difficulties of implementing certain 6? Is there a need for new skills, information, machinery, but also biophysical factors? Obviously, sometimes conditions are favorable or unfavorable for certain 6, and there are issues with certain crop types. We looked at knowledge and information, awareness, availability of information, costs of obtaining information, the capacity of farm advisory services, and broader economic factors such as prices, consumer preferences, investments, labor costs versus benefits. Okay. Very briefly, how did we identify the barriers? As I said, what I'm reporting today is mainly based on data that we collected at study site level. We also involved EU stakeholders in our work. We ran some interviews, some workshops, and we will describe them in a bit more detail later on. But the work that I'm presenting here is really based on the data collected at study site level. We carried out 47 interviews in the study site regions. When I said we, it was the colleagues working in the sites who did the work. So whilst me and my colleagues at Milieu have coordinated this work, a lot of the work was really carried out by our colleagues. So thank you to our study site colleagues. And we also organized 13 stakeholder workshops in the study site regions on adoption specifically. As Rudi already explained, we did a large number of workshops in the sites, but I'm referring to specific adoption workshops that we organized, and those involved more than 180 participants across the different sites. And what was done at those workshops was to look at the different 6 tested at the site, at the potential benefits, at the costs, and at the barriers and also possible actions to remove those barriers or to strengthen enablers. And we will get back to some of these actions that were identified and the recommendations later in the day. But at this point, we want to focus on the barriers that we identified. And I will just try to give you some examples for each of the category of barrier that we looked at. So what stakeholders reported was that sometimes policies have adverse effects or non-intended effects. And one example was reported from the UK, where farmers are encouraged to plant crop mixes to favor bees and birds, but which do not provide a very good soil cover. We've also learned that from, for example, from Belgium, that farmers do convert permanent grassland to arable land in order to avoid that classification as permanent grassland under the Common Agricultural Policy, which avoids changes later on. And I should highlight that when I give you these examples, it doesn't mean that these factors were only identified in that specific site. These are factors that were found generally across sites. We see a lack of policy coherence, we see policy conflicts. Annemie reported the example from Belgium where waste legislation prevents the application of wood chips on the fields. A lot of times stakeholders reported that there might be a conflict between SIG's adoption and food policy. In many countries, there's obviously an emphasis on food production. And if you experience a decrease in yield, which might happen with some of these SIGs, that is in conflict with these policy objectives. We also see that in many countries there are unstable policy frameworks. The example again comes from Belgium, where there might be changes every 2-3 years, which is not very motivating to farmers, obviously, to invest in new practices to improve soil quality. The same goes for situations where there is a lack of policies are not updated, but where farmers do expect that they might be updated. That also prevents sometimes from taking up new practices. In many sites, it was reported that policies are inflexible, they're top-down, which is perceived by farmers as something that tells them what to do and how to do things, not taking into account their own experiences, their own knowledge. We also see that sometimes policies, especially economic instruments, incentivize certain practices that might work well and be beneficial in some parts of a country, but not another. An example I have here is from Portugal, where the use of winter cover crops is incentivized, but it's in fact not suitable to all regions. And this is really something that featured across the different study sites. There's a lack of soil-specific binding legislation. I think we're all very familiar with that. It's something that is lacking at EU level. It's also something that's lacking in many countries, many European countries. And what we see a lot of times that there are positive impacts on soil quality or different soil functions through other pieces of legislation, most notably water legislation. We also see there's a lack of monitoring and enforcement. An example reported to us was from the UK, where less than 1% of payment recipients under the cap are inspected by the rural paying agencies. Then we move on to economic costs, and I was quite happy to see in the chat that some of your comments focused on costs and the costs of transitioning to new practices, costs involved in buying new equipment or maybe adapting existing equipment, purchasing of new crops or additional seeds if you're implementing cover crops. The example I have here is from Greece, where there was a change from orange orchards to avocado, and obviously buying those trees alone is quite an investment. And if you don't see the immediate benefits, that is obviously something that prevents many farmers, many producers from making that switch. Obviously, especially if you're looking at soil and soil quality, it takes a long time to see any changes. So changes between the implementation of a practice to these positive changes on soil quality, but also to experience financial benefits. That is a barrier that was reported across many sites. And obviously, there are wider market pressures and demands that might prevent farmers from changing the practices. One example was reported from Belgium, where it's actually where farmers have reported that it's financially more attractive to invest in crops and to grow crops that are demanded by the market, rather than participate in the common agricultural policy and to receive payments through the agricultural policy. If we move to socio-cultural barriers, again, wide reports that there is a lack of awareness for soil, the valuing of soil. Consumers are not aware of the impacts of certain practices on soil, and that there is a need to increase this knowledge on the consumer side as well. On the plus side, there's a growing demand for organic food and sustainably produced food. But we also see that within the farming community, there is peer pressure, which might prevent some farmers from taking up new practices. And there was an example from Switzerland where it was reported that sometimes new practices can look messy or just different from practices farmers are used to, and that might be a barrier to some farmers, especially if they're early adopters. And then finally, and that links to what I just said, the extent to which a practice is established or perceived to be part of the local tradition might also play a role. And the example here comes from Greece, where olive production plays a huge part of the local culture, of its history. So in a way, farmers also see themselves as stewards of a tradition, and rightly so. So there might be a reluctance to make a change. Finally, we come to knowledge and information. And this was an area where we received a lot of comments. There were lots of information, lots of observations from stakeholders. So this is really an area where many barriers exist. And it starts with the availability of information. And here I included a positive example from Belgium, where the use of cover crops was linked to the good information that was available to farmers. There is a lack of fragmentation in advisory services. What we see nowadays is that we have different service providers, which might impact on the quality that is of the advice that is provided. Sometimes the advice might be inconsistent. And here it was reported from Spain, for example, that there is no unified certification showing the knowledge and the qualification of a service provider, which might affect the quality of the advice provided. At the same time, getting advice costs money, attending meetings costs time, and that needs to be taken into account as well. If we look at the advisory services again, in many cases, there's insufficient funding for advisory services, which means that there is not really a continuous service provision of good quality. Now, this was just a very short overview of some of the factors that we've encountered, some of the examples. Hopefully, if you have any questions, I can provide some further examples. As you know, we also have colleagues here from the sites who might be able to give you a bit more insight into some of these adoption factors that they have discussed with their stakeholders. And with that, I would hand over to Matt. And while Matt is taking some time to join, I also wanted to point out that at the bottom of the screen, you can again go to some of the products that we have developed, some of the outputs. And I wanted to highlight that we have produced country reports for each of the study sites, which give you an overview of the policy framework and the policy situation in each of these sites. And it also gives you an overview of the different barriers that were identified and the actions that the stakeholders identified. This is summarized, so this is presented in a report. It's also summarized in short policy summaries. So if you click on that button just below my face, I think you will be taken there, and then you should find one summary for each site, which gives you a bit more detail than I was able to provide in this short presentation.
Hello, Melanie. I'm so sorry. We're having a little problem with one of the computers.
That's fine.
Which is unfortunately my computer, which is just making life very tricky for us at the moment. So I'm in a different place, but I'm here with you. That was really fascinating and I think really helpful to people. And so we've had some really great responses in the questions. So I've got a first response, which is and a question. Are there differences between the types of barriers for the different practices? So
yes, there is, and I will share my screen if that is okay with you.
Yeah, please do.
Because I did. Oh, can you see it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hang on. I just need to. I had one slide that I did not show. Simply for time reasons. So we actually, if you remember, Rudy introduced different clusters, which we used to do separate types of analysis for the different types of cropping systems. And we also analyzed our data for each of these clusters. And what you see here is the feedback that we received in these adoption workshops organized by cluster, and you can see the different bars. They indicate the different types of adoption barriers. So it gives you it gives you an indication of the relative importance of the different types of factors, and you can see some differences. So, for example, the orange indicates economic factors, and we see that economic factors were particularly highlighted or frequently mentioned in the soil improving crops cluster and in the soil cultivation cluster, which at least I would say is not very surprising, because these are the practices where you might have to, let's say, purchase additional crops. If you do cover crops, you have to invest in machinery. Whereas if we look at the last cluster, fertilization and amendments, here we see that policy is slightly more important, which again I don't think is that surprising, because if you remember Annemie's presentation, there are certain barriers when it comes to applying different types of fertilizers or amendments to the field, not just in Belgium, but we see that in other countries where different amendments were tested. It's also, I think, interesting to highlight that I think in all of the clusters, knowledge and information played a very big role. And we were actually expecting that the policy was one of the main factors across all clusters, but that's actually not the case. So you can see some differences here.
Yeah, no, that's great, and very interesting to hear that maybe knowledge and information is a bigger barrier than policy, because I think very often, for understandable reasons, we talk about policy, but actually dissemination, sharing information, getting good practice to people is a huge thing, which kind of takes us on to how do we make 6 the new normal on the ground? How do we take it to land managers and farmers?
That's a very broad question.
I'm afraid, yes.
That's a very broad question. Yes, and I think we will tackle that in later part of the day. But I think my immediate response is that if you look at the spread of the factors that we found, I think it's pretty clear that there is no one solution and that it always needs to be a mix of solutions. I also think that a lot of times when we talk about soil management or agriculture, we talk a lot about farmers. And I think we've kind of fallen into that trap as well. I think we need to look at it from a systemic perspective in many ways. So I think it's important to understand that it's about creating an environment that facilitates that transition, not just for farmers. And obviously, it's really important that we provide the right economic and financial environment, that we provide the incentives, etc. But I think it's equally important that we think about the consumer. We need to think about the whole value chain. It's not just a question of farmers and farmer choice. A farmer is caught in a very complex system, and I think it requires complex solutions that tweak all parts of the system. So it's I think maybe a bit misleading to talk about adoption of 6. I think we need to look at it more broadly.
That's great, thank you. And it's also lovely to, I think, trail what we'll be talking about this afternoon. So what we're going to do now is move to a little poll and ask people some opinions. The observant among you may have noticed I was joined momentarily by Charlotte, who's doing all of the background work, who's just lined up a new poll. So if you just look in the new poll, it says, which of the priority actions identified by stakeholders do you consider as being important for facilitating the adoption of 6? And this, you in this instance, is those of you who are listening, taking part and contributing. So please get voting. So this would include none of the actions, would optimize it, optimize technologies. So please vote now.
So it's that one.
It's
the barrier one.
This barrier one. Yeah. Thank you.
But it's okay. We see the correct poll.
You see the correct poll.
Yes.
That's good. I don't see the correct poll, so that's a relief. But if you're seeing the correct poll, that makes a big difference.
Yes.
Great.
The question is, which of the following do you think is the main barrier to the uptake of soil improving cropping systems? Which should be the poll you're all seeing, and I can see you're all voting.
Yeah,
so
that's great. Thank you. Phew, good job there's 2 of us doing this. So we just give people a moment to do that. And so just keep voting, people. We can see, it's nice to be able to see the bars actually move as people vote, which is quite fun. Okay, we'll just give people sort of 60 seconds now just to finish voting, because obviously there's, I'm guessing that we're having maybe some slight lags occasionally, some slight differences of service. So just give people a chance to actually do that.
You can do another question.
Okay. Right. So I think the poll seems to be coming to a close, although I still see a little bit of movement. Okay, let's call the poll closed now. I don't think we're going to see substantial change now. So, when posing the question, which of the following do you think is the main barrier? Most people are suggesting that the economic, the price, supply chain arrangements, those sort of things. So what would your initial thoughts be to that, Mel?
Well, I didn't vote, but...
That's very honest of you.
But I would have probably picked the same, or I would say that the selection really reflects my thinking, and I think it reflects what I said earlier, that we need to look at it from a systemic perspective. In the end, it's a social, technical, institutional system that we need to think about. So I think it's correct that it's not just about enabling farmers to take up these practices through knowledge, through economic instruments. It's also about having the economic system that supports that, whether that is through educating consumers, labeling, certification, pricing, but also arrangements with retailers. So I think I'm not surprised, and I think it reflects how I would see the situation.
Great, thank you. And I can see that the second most popular was knowledge and information, which is a point that you've already addressed, which I think is really exciting. But also the third one, which is perhaps quite interesting for us, is social and cultural barriers on the farm. Farmer attitudes, what accepted behaviours are, pressures between farmers. Does that provoke any thoughts in you?
Again, I mean, we've seen the importance of all these factors across the different sites, and I agree that we should not underestimate the relevance of norms and attitudes and knowledge. I mean, they go together a little bit, and I would think, I'm not 100% sure, but I think we've seen this across all sides, the attitudes we find among farmers. And what a lot of stakeholders mentioned is the opportunity we now have with the demographic change that we're facing. And I think that reflects that, it acknowledges that maybe these community attitudes need to change, and that maybe it is linked with new farmers coming in who are maybe a bit more open, who are also educated in a different way, and that provides an opportunity to maybe change some of these attitudes and perceptions. So I'm not surprised that it's something that people feel is important.
Lovely, thank you. Now, one last question, and this has been framed is, are there geographical differences, which sometimes classically we've said between, say, the south and the north of Europe, but you may have observed others?
I wouldn't say that there are a lot of differences, not even when you look at factors that you would expect to differ, such as sociocultural and knowledge and information factors. I think where you see the differences, but that's hardly surprising, and I know I didn't elaborate a lot on those, are obviously some of the technical and biophysical factors, because they are deeply rooted within the context that you're in. So what we see is, for example, talking about cover crops. Obviously, the climate makes a big difference. The length of the growing season makes a big difference. Also, when it comes to technical barriers, yes, there might be some differences in the availability and affordability of machines. Also, the extent to which you already have, let's say, collaborations between different organizations and farmers. So if there's a strong local network and tradition of farmers collaborating, I think that can make a difference, and you sometimes see differences between the regions when it comes to that. But I think overall, I wouldn't say we've seen a lot of differences geographically.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful, and I think that sort of being focused and attentive to what's happening on the ground rather than sort of using broad kind of characterizations is always helpful to hear.